Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Joel Burdick. He's a professor at California Institute of Technology, Caltech. He got his degrees, undergraduate degrees at Duke University. I won't say the year. One of them is in, actually I even know this, chemistry, and the other is in mechanical engineering. Afterwards, he got his master's and PhDs from Stanford University in mechanical engineering, and then started as a professor at Caltech in 1988. As his bio lists, he has all sorts of best paper nominations, all sorts of awards. He got the what is today's version of the Career Award back in the early days when few people got that award. That's a polite way to say that was an accomplishment and insult the award at the same time. Also the Young Investigator Award and the Feynman Award as well. He also has graduated a large group of very, very successful students.
There's a few exceptions.
But only few. The thing to say about Joel is I remember, the one funny story, well, it's actually a few, but the one that stands out in my mind, well, too many stand out in my mind, the one I feel like saying now is, I remember in my fourth year, at the beginning of my fourth year, Joel got an O&R award. I think maybe it was the O&R Young Investigator Award. And I went up to him and congratulated him about getting this award. And he smiled and pat me on the shoulder and said, "Don't worry, you're funded for the next 3 years." And 3 more. So with that, I give you Joel. And
Great, thanks, Howie. Thanks for everyone coming. So I am an old robot guy. I've been building robots longer than most of you in the audience been alive, except for Matt, of course. But about 15 years ago, I started working with neurobiologists. And 12 years ago, I started working in particular on spinal cord injury. So half my group works on spinal cord injury. It's something I don't report on in the robotics community. So it's great that I have this opportunity to kind of share this work with you. It's very personal to me. I really love this project. And so the first message I want to get across is I'm the messenger for a big team. I'm going to show you a lot of stuff today that took a lot of people to do. So 12 years ago, I met this guy named Reggie Edgerton at UCLA who spent his whole life doing spinal cord injury. Then we worked together, and I'll show you some of our early work. We then brought in engineers, YC Tai at Caltech, a micromachinist. We started doing human work in Louisville, Kentucky. So all the research there in the early part of the talk has been led by Susan Harkema. And we have a fantastic collaborator from Russia named Yuri Gerasimenko, who heads the Neuroscience Institute at the Pavlov Institute. And yes, that's the Pavlov Dog Institute. So he actually runs Pavlov's laboratory. And so, again, this is a lot of other people's work. I've been involved in all the work here, but I didn't lead all the work. And so the first part of the talk, I'll talk about some general results from our program. Then I'll talk about a few technical details. And then I'll kind of talk about some blue sky stuff of where we're going. So many of you may not be intimately familiar with spinal cord injury, but you probably know the late Christopher Reeves, who was a real champion of spinal cord injury. I received some funding from his foundation. This actually is a false color x-ray of his neck. So he had what's called a C12 injury. Oh, that's not good. Sorry. That's my VPN to Caltech. And so one of the worst injuries that you can sort of imagine, and it's only because of both his fortitude and also his financial resources, he could actually live for a fairly long time. People with that injury don't typically live very long. So what you may not know then is that actually there's over 1 million people in the US with some level of spinal cord injury. Now, some people with these injuries can function fairly well, but there's about 400,000 people with what we'll call a severe spinal cord injury. It's severe enough that they're constrained to wheelchairs. And there's about 11,000 to 12,000 new cases a year. And the particular injury that our team focuses on is the worst injury called the complete injury, which means below the level of the injury, they've not been able to demonstrate any motor function whatsoever, typically no sensory function also. Now, the amazing thing that I didn't know until I started working with spinal cord patients is that if you ask them, and people have done these studies, what 5 things could you have back after your injury? Actually, walking typically is not top 5. And so the top things are things like bladder function, because spinal cord patients typically have to use a catheter. They have frequent infections. Spinal cord patients die at a rate 11 times the general population from bladder complications. They have to spend 60 to 90 minutes a day managing their bowel, compared to the average person extra time. They can't regulate their temperature. They have muscle bone loss, all kinds of things. And so in typical, over their lifetime, they have to spend at least $1 million to more than $4 million extra in healthcare costs compared to the average US sort of individual. So it's a very costly disease. And so some people were sort of smiling in the front, those of you in the back can't see, because the average age of a typical spinal cord injury is in the 20s and they're typically male. Actually, loss of sexual function is the top priority for most of these candidates. And so here you can kind of see a broad distribution of how people get spinal cord injury in the US and the age distribution. And the key thing, as I said, is that a typical patient will last for 30 or 40 years with their injury, so that's why they rack up lots of medical expenses. And so here's just a little list. The amazing thing is they'll have up to $1 million in the first year just to manage their life and to sort of get them stabilized, and then significant costs sort of after that. Now, I'm going to give you the engineering version of the neuroscience of spinal cord injury. It's very simplistic. I apologize to any of the specialists in the audience how crude this is. So as you know, when you go play tennis or do other kinds of things, you in effect have direct connections between your cortex and your individual muscles. So obviously after a major spinal cord injury, voluntary control is lost because there's a break between your cortex and the lower spinal cord. And in general, what many labs around the world are working on is what we think is the right strategy in the long term. And that is, how do you actually connect the brain back up to the lower spinal cord so you can reconnect the voluntary connections and allow the patients to recover all the function that they lost. And so people are working on, in the first few hours after the injury, how can you stabilize the spinal cord and use drugs to minimize the sort of amount of damage from the chemical cascades of inflammation. In the longer term, with a chronic injury, all kinds of tissue engineering approaches are being developed so that you can basically grow in one way or another tissue that you transplant into the injury area and then hope to sort of regrow connections to allow sort of recovery of function. Other people are trying to trick the central nervous system to behave like the peripheral nervous system, which actually does regrow sort of neurons. And all these strategies we believe are the long-term strategies, but I'm not a young man anymore, and I'm not going to be alive when these things happen. And so we've been interested in something sort of nearer term, and that is because right now, for the particular complete injuries that we're most interested in, the current sort of standard of care is to, after the injury, stabilize themselves, give them physical therapy to try to slow down the decay in their muscles and bone loss and other things, give them drugs to manage all these side effects, and give them occupational therapy to, deal with their new kind of diminished sort of capacity and go on with life as best as possible. So the concept of our team is based on an old idea that's been around in the literature for years. And some of you may have seen this before, particularly in robotics. Many of you know about the concept of central pattern generator. So the idea is in your lower spinal cord, you've got special circuitry that would actually help sort of generate rhythmic motions of your legs. So when you're doing simple things like walking on a flat floor and you're talking to your colleague, your brain is in fact actually not much involved in locomotion. There's actually special circuitry there which actually help coordinate the leg motions by taking information in from all of your sensory and muscles, all your surface and sensory muscles sensors, and using that to make decisions about how to regulate the muscles instant by instant. Now, not everyone believes in the central pattern generator philosophy, so there's a beautiful word from the Russian literature that we like, translated is called automaticity. So the idea is not only for simple stepping, but certainly standing at a cocktail party. Similarly, your brain's not much involved in standing. You have specialized circuitry there, which takes information from the brain and actually coordinates the muscles in a very simple way. And so while we don't necessarily need the issue of a central pattern generator, you as robot engineers can then appreciate the spinal cord in many ways is a distributed control system. So a lot of the control is down here in the lower spinal cord. So our idea then is to go ahead and use that circuitry. And the reason is because after a major spinal cord injury, so even though the brain connection is necessary to turn on the circuitry, and after an injury, the circuitry now can no longer be turned on by the brain, the circuitry doesn't decay. It actually lasts for decades. And so that's what we sort of take advantage of. And sort of the idea is to build, in effect, a machine to spine interface. So what we want to do then is to connect to the spinal cord and find out ways to modulate it below the injury. So we're not trying to connect the brain up. We're saying the spinal cord itself, and I'll convince you in a minute, has enough onboard control that we can do simple things. So we're not trying to get these patients to win Dancing with the Stars. They're not going to do that, but hopefully we can get them to stand, as you'll see, and take a couple simple steps, and this will allow them to improve the quality of their lives. So there's a three-part strategy. So this is the part, pay attention, you can go to sleep, the rest of the talk is details after this slide. So this is the strategy that we use. So the first and sort of sexy part of what we use was called epidural stimulation. So you may have heard the word epidural when it comes to childbirth. So all around your dura, which is the thick sheath which surrounds your spinal cord and your brain, and outside of the dura and inside the vertebral wall, you have a space called the epidural space. Normally nature puts some fat in there so when you bend over you don't pinch your cord. But what we do then is we basically open up that epidural space and stuff electrodes in there. So there's different kinds of electrodes we use, and so sometimes what we do is we take a part of a vertebra off and we stick the electrode down in the space. Sometimes with really long electrodes, we take another vertebra off below the area that we want to kind of control and sort of pull the electrode down and then suture it in place on the cord. Now the reason we use epidural and not some other approach, so we could actually get much better control if we open up the dura and go right into the neural tissue, but that exposes the patients to central nervous system infection, which is a horrible thing that you don't want to contemplate. And so while we would love to have better control, we're actually happy with the safer approach that we're taking. Now, the second thing is physical therapy. It's a very simple idea, but it's absolutely crucial to this technique. So let me use a really crude analogy. So the spinal cord grew up speaking Italian. It got injured, and now we shove this array in there that's shouting German at it, so somehow it's got to learn German. And the way that it does it is by just physical therapy. And so I'm an old robot guy, so what you see in the early days with the animals, we use robots to administer the therapy. There's nothing super special about robots. For the humans, we've used just traditional therapists, although we're now moving back to a robotic model. And the third part, which I won't talk about today, but it's kind of important to understand, is normally there are certain key, what are called monoamine neurotransmitters that are created in your brain and transported down your spinal cord. They're all the ones involved in psychiatric conditions: serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine. And so after a spinal cord injury, this transport process is blocked, and so the lower spinal cord is kind of frozen. And so what we do is throw drugs in there also to kind of help wake the spinal cord up again to allow then the other therapies to kind of do their job better. And so just on the next slide, I'm going to show you something. So this is one of the robots we first developed for doing sort of studies with mice and rats. And it's a very, very simple robot. And the key thing about it is that the linkages here, which drive the ankles, are so low in mass and so low in friction that even paralyzed animals can sort of move them. So this is ancient work. This is from 15 years ago when I first got into the business. And so we were working with Reggie Edgerton. We were interested in two of those three strategies. We hadn't figured out the epidural stimulation. This was just sort of drugs and robots. So we wanted to see, could robot therapy, what was the best way to use robot therapy combined with drugs to actually recover sort of function after spinal cord injury. So these are mice where we completely transect their spinal cord. We actually put plastic between both halves, so we know there can be no regrowth. And so on the right here, this is an animal 1 week after its transection. Every day we give it a drug called quipazine, which is a serotonin agonist. Every day our little robot sort of trains it. And then once a week, what we would do is actually sort of test it. And so here, the robot is not driving the mouse is sort of driving the robot. So after 1 week of recovery after the transection, you can see a little bit of motion, but not too much. About 4 weeks after, you start to see some organized stepping kind of recover. And typically in mice and rats, what we see is after about 6 weeks, you see fairly organized stepping. Now, in many ways, this is completely worthless because what happens is the mice you train to step don't stand, and the mice you train to stand can't step. And there's only a kind of a limited range of speeds on the treadmill that they can really kind of accommodate. So it showed us we were kind of on the right path, but we needed some way to actually better modulate the cord to make it more adaptable to kind of the current situations. So this is where Yuri Gerasimenko came in. So he's, again, a well-known Russian neuroscientist, and there's things you can do in Russia that you can't do here. And so he had knowledge of a number of studies that hadn't been done in the US. And so we had technology, and so it was a great marriage. So now he actually spends more than half the year at UCLA. So but some of the first studies, he showed us how to actually put just sort of two simple wires over the lumbosacral part where the spinal locomotor circuitry is. And then we use drugs every day, quipazine, plus sometimes some other drugs, and then also combine it with our little robot to sort of exercise it every day. So this is a rat on a treadmill on the left right here, a couple weeks after its transection and these therapies every day. You'll notice the hind limbs are up because they're not paralyzed. We don't want them to interfere with the evaluation of locomotion. So it looks a little unnatural. But what you can see is just a few weeks after the injury, the animal can kind of recover stepping. So the key idea is we're not trying to simulate the muscles at an instant-by-instant basis to get the stepping. We're actually stimulating the spinal cord, which normally takes care of that stepping, to the level where it can actually act close to like what a healthy spinal cord would act. What blew my mind when I first saw this was actually when you turn the treadmill backwards, the animal starts stepping backwards. So you can see actually a lot of that decision about how to do that is actually in the lower spinal cord, at least for rodents, all right? And then you can even turn the animal sideways, and it will step sideways just perfectly fine. With, again, the brain's been completely disconnected from the lower spinal cord. Okay, so I'm a real meat and potatoes engineer, Howie can tell you that. So I'm like, hey, if 2 wires are good, dozens of wires got to be better, right? So we started working for a decade with a guy named Yu-Chang Tai at Caltech, who's a micro machine expert, to build microfabricated arrays. So this is kind of the intermediate stage that we were a couple years ago. We're working on some new array technology yet, which hasn't quite matured. These arrays are made with silicon microfabrication. We use a material called parylene, which is a biocompatible polymer. You lay that down. You deposit then platinum or tungsten or gold traces over it, and then 27 electrodes. We have a line of electrodes over every vertebral segment involved in locomotion, and then ones that are sort of left and right. And here's a blow-up of what the electrodes look like. They have this complex waffle pattern, so you minimize cell adhesion and charge injection and kind of a bunch of other properties. And so it took years to kind of get to there. But once you sort of do that, what you'll see here on the right is sort of the difference between simple wires and sort of more advanced electrodes. So because we could actually stimulate many parts of the spinal cord now in better sort of ways, here what you see on the left is this is Uri's 2 wires, and we're stimulating the same spot over here with the electrode. We get better charge injection, so it works better. Now, you can also then preferentially turn on standing versus stepping. And then you can also do things like here, the animal, we can steer them left, we can steer them right, you can speed them up, you can slow them down a little bit. And again, what I have to confirm or remind you is that the brain is completely disconnected from the spinal cord. So this is a complete machine-to-spine interface with no brain intervention whatsoever. Now, we still do animal work. But about 7 years ago, we convinced the FDA from those animal studies that we could go to humans. Now, that technology I showed you for rats is not ready yet for humans. So we looked around and wanted to adapt an FDA-approved technology. So I didn't know this till I started working in this field. A number of companies make epidural electrode arrays, just like we want, that are used for back pain. So people whose pain is so severe that it can't be sort of fixed by drugs or surgeries. This is an array from Medtronic that we use. You'll see a better picture in a second. There's actually 16 individual electrodes. So you implant this in the epidural space. So in the surgery room, you take off a vertebra, you shove this in. This is actually a CT scan from our first patient I'll talk about in a second. I was actually in the surgery room when that actually happened. You then connect these electrodes to an implantable, what's called IPG. So this has a battery that you can recharge wirelessly and also has a wireless communication channel. So you can then sort of turn the electrode off and on and also configure it in different ways. So normally for the back pain application, they put the array where the pain is related, and then what they do is they stimulate the array in the following way. So for each electrode that's turned on, and that's one of the parameters you can decide, is which electrodes do I turn on, and that's something which is figured out adaptively by the clinicians with each patient. You send a series of pulses that are charge balanced, so that over one cycle, the amount of charge going in and out of the body is sort of fixed or constant or zero. And then what you can do is you can adjust the amplitude of these pulses and the frequency and the pulse width, okay, for all the electrodes that are turned on. All right, so what we do is we then implant these over the epidural space, over the lumbosacral spinal cord here where locomotion is. For the pain application, you send about 1,000 pulses per second. When you work through the math, that actually what's called hyperpolarizes the neurons, so they're deadened, so they can't transmit pain. So we use a very low frequency, about 20 to 40 hertz, which actually excites those neurons. We want to awake that circuitry again, and then modulate it in a way to enable stepping. All right. So our first patient was actually younger than many of you in the audience. His name was Rob Summers. He was a premier athlete. He was a pitcher on the NCAA Division I National Championship team. He was going to the majors when a car hit him, left him for dead. It was a hit-and-run accident. They actually never found the car driver. And so he had a severe crush injury. This is an MRI of his spinal cord in what's called the C6 through T2 area. This is about right here on the spinal cord. And so after he was injured, he had lost all control of his muscles below the level of the injury, and actually even had partial loss of his hands, although he is an amazing guy and worked forever to get his hands back. So he volunteered to be sort of the first implant. So what we wanted to check then is, what is the implant doing compared to an unimplanted person? So normally you would have a control. You have an unimplanted person and an implanted person. We actually use each patient as their own control. The way they do that is for almost a year before the surgery, you give them 80 sessions of what's called stand training. So therapists basically manually stand them up and move their legs and try to get them to learn how to stand again. And then 80 sessions of step therapy where we put them on a treadmill and move their legs. You'll see a video a little bit later. And then we sort of see where are they. So in his particular case, he recovered no function, even after that extensive training. So then we implant the array and we do exactly the same 160 sessions afterwards. So then the hypothesis is that the difference must be from the array. So he was implanted, and a surprising thing was it takes about 2 weeks for the surgery to heal. So after checking out the arrays for a couple days, Susan Harkema, who again, let me emphasize, she's the head of the clinic in Louisville and organizes all this sort of human research there and runs it and conceptualizes it. She said, okay, Rob, let's see what you can do. And he stood up first day. It was, an amazing experience. So this is him just a few days after his array was turned on, standing what's called a stand frame. And so as you can imagine, it's not great standing. I'll show you a video in a second. So they do need a little help with balancing because sometimes if they start to fall, they can kind of catch themselves. So he's a paraplegic, not a quad, so he can use his upper body to help stabilize himself. So this is about 4 months after his surgery. This is what a typical training session looks like. The array is not on all day long. So he'll wheel up in his wheelchair to the stand frame because he's paralyzed. They then turn the array on at a low level. He'll pop out of the wheelchair. This therapist is holding his knees because he would fall down if he didn't because he's paralyzed. And so this therapist here has the remote programmer, and what she's doing now is dialing up the voltage and the pattern. And so as the voltage gets to the right level, each patient's a little bit different. Rob would like to do is either give a verbal or sometimes a little physical wiggle to indicate, okay, I'm ready to stand. And so this is what we call independent standing, that he doesn't need the aid of a therapist to sort of stand up. And Rob, and actually all the other patients I'll talk about later, so could oftentimes, for short periods, actually stand without actually touching the stand frame as well. So it's not perfect, right? He's vibrating. But again, this was a person who, for 3 years, actually hadn't moved a muscle voluntarily below the level sort of his injury. So what you see in all these diagrams around the video here are these sensors on here. Some are tracking his motion and some are actually picking up muscle activity. So these are the main muscles for postural and locomotion control up here. And so what you see in the diagram is for each of these muscles, when the therapist has the voltage down low, that circuitry is not engaged or woken up. And as the voltage reaches a certain threshold level, all of a sudden the circuit says, hey, I'm at a cocktail party. And so it starts standing. And then if you get the voltage up too high, they just start vibrating. It's very uncomfortable and you have to kind of dial it back.
So can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So I'm assuming he doesn't feel anything when he's standing.
No, what happens is he says he feels something that is very hard to describe what the feeling is because it's not a normal physical feeling. But he does not have, so he was an Asia AB, which means he had no motor control. He actually had a little sensation in his big toes, which may have played a small role. But they said they all say they can feel something, but they can't quite describe it to you. And then what you can show is, even if you ask them then to sort of shift left and right, what you see is the actual muscles responding like you would get with a left-right shift in a sort of healthy patient. So we're actually engaging and using these circuits.
Can I just have a quick question as well? So can you tell us a little bit more about the process by which the clinician tunes each electrode?
I'm going to spend a lot of time on that later.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So right now, up until this date, except for the trials, and I'm going to tell you about the whole theory today. That's what I do work on. It was manual intuition, just trial and error, and that's a big issue that I'm going to spend a lot of time on today. Okay, so we thought this was great. What do we do next? So we just continued the therapy just to sort of see how things would go over time. And so a bunch of things happened that we never predicted. We just got lucky, all right? So we didn't plan this. So thing number one which happened is Rob uses a catheter, and so after about 5 months he started reporting recovery of bladder control. He started voiding his bladder. And so he never fully recovered bladder control like you and I would have, but he actually no longer needs a catheter. So after about a year he could pretty much drop catheter usage. His blood pressure became regular. Many patients have something called autonomic dysreflexia, where the blood pressure ratchets up and down because the nervous system feels something and then sort of has a mistaken sort of reaction to that. He no longer went off all that medication. His bowel control sort of became much more regular. So what we didn't know, we sort of all of a sudden found out later, where actually the array sits over part of the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems which control bladder and bowel. So that may be part of it, and part of it's an exercise phenomenon. So the next thing that happened we never predicted predicted, and this is a funny story I'll tell you. So he's a very funny guy, and so he, once a month he has to be laid down like this and instrumented just to check out the array and check him out, and it's really boring. So he talked to the therapist next to him one day and said, look, I'm going to play a joke on Susie. Susan Harcum here, the leader of the effort in Kentucky, and I'm just going to say, Susie, look, I can move my toe. And he moved his toe. And so Susie's like, oh shit, get the cameras rolling. And so unfortunately my audio is kind of goofed up today, so I'm going to repeat the audio that you hear. So now she's actually giving him verbal commands to move different body parts.
Left toe.
Left toe up. So you'll see a small movement there, not impressive. Left leg up.
Left leg down. Left leg up.
And so he can repeat this multiple times. And so the key thing which I want to show you over here is when the electrode is turned off, these are again muscle activity from all the postural muscles. He can not do any movement of the legs in synchrony with the verbal command, which is this black bar here. As soon as you turn the electrode array on, then actually sort of voluntary control is enabled again. And again, we're not stimulating specific muscles to make this happen. It's just a tonic stimulation which allows him to reconnect the brain to his lower legs. I'm going to come back to how we think that happens in a few minutes after I talk about a few other things. So about this time we recognize this, he was transitioning to step training anyway. So this is how classical step training is done with patients, even unstimulated patients. Here he's supported by a weight harness which partially supports his weight. So what you saw is he can move his legs, but he can't pick up his leg and stand on his own without some support. He'll fall over. But we can set the array, unfortunately, only so that he can then optimize the stimulation so we can do voluntary control of stepping on one side and the therapist has to do the other, and then we can kind of switch. It's a limitation in the technology we have right now. So this is about 8 months after his surgery. And so what you can see is he can make small voluntary steps on the right-hand side, but as I said, the therapist is working the left-hand side, but we can change the stimulation to actually alternate. So it's more of a limitation in the technology than a limitation in his spinal cord. So this is about 4 years ago now, so Rob continues to train and continues to recover better voluntary control. They do plateau, so the increases now are sort of relatively slow. And so one of the first things you might ask is, okay, is Rob special somehow? Can this be repeated? So 3 other patients have actually now completed the complete 2-year study in Louisville. There's actually 2 other patients just about to complete. And we've had great success in all of these things. So a funny thing is the patients are very competitive. So patient number 2, when he saw Rob do voluntary control, is like, I got to do this. Even though he tell him, like, don't do this. You're ruining our scientific controls. And like, yeah, screw it. I'm going to practice my voluntary control. So he stood on the first day. It took him about 4 weeks to recover voluntary control. So what we hypothesized from him is that it couldn't be that we're regrowing neurons to get the voluntary control. It actually somehow is native there that stimulation allows to do it. So patient number 3 saw patient number 2. He stood the first day and he got voluntary control in 4 days. So really we're not growing neurons in 4 days. And so patient number 4 actually took about a week to get him to stand well. But he actually recovered voluntary control on the first day in 4 hours. And so, you know, that was his big success, is that he could do that sort of quickly. So let me just show you patient number 2. Patient number 2, this is about 4 months after his surgery. So he was a motorcycle rider, actually semi-professional, who flipped his bike. He was completely paralyzed, Asia A, before the level of his injury. And so, again, he can't stand up and do it, but down supine like this, he can, you know, do quite substantial voluntary control. He was one of our best standers, and he was a very funny guy. So he has the thrill-seeking gene. So even after he was paralyzed, he used to go duct tape himself to ATVs so he could continue to race. And so, you know, I asked him one time, I was like, dude, you know, aren't you worried about getting hurt? And he's like, dude, I'm already paralyzed. And so here's another one funny thing. So what this plots right here is number of days after the array was turned on. What's plotted here is in blue the total time of his therapy per day. In black is how much he was able to stand independently. So within 1 month, he was actually able to stand continually for 16 minutes on his own. And then it went down. And you're like, why does it go down? This guy needed so much stimulation, he got bored and started falling asleep. So we actually had to move in video games and audio and music so he could stay awake while he was training. Okay, let me come back to this issue of why we think we see this recovery of voluntary motion. And so even in the worst spinal cord injuries, there's a little bit of remnant cord left. And so the philosophy that we have right now, and we're actually now working on an animal, one of my students is working on an animal model of this, is that little bit of cord, there's some signal getting down to the sort of automatic circuitry down there and the other postural circuitry, but that circuitry, because of the chemical imbalance, has been sort of frozen, and so it can't act on the signal that's getting there. When we reawaken that surgery and modulate it properly, then that small signal can do things. So you see simple voluntary motion. So again, none of them have recovered full voluntary control. We never expect that, and each one recovers slightly different types of capability as well. Okay, so let me switch. I'm going to now focus and actually answer your question in quite detail today, is some of the things that I work on as an engineer. So I was involved in all those human studies as well, but the particular thing that I focus on are the engineering challenges of dealing with the complexity of these arrays. So we can now build arrays of arbitrary complexity. So the question is how to use them. So here's just some simple numbers. So this is, again, I apologize, it's a bad picture. It's a Medtronic array. There's 16 electrodes here. And if you take the number of combinations of how you can turn the electrodes on and the number of voltages, even in the range, which you know for the patients and the frequencies, there's over 1 billion combinations that you can try. And so how do you sort of hand find that for sort of every patient? So the people in Louisville have gotten really good at sort of intuiting and using their knowledge about how to fine tune it for each patient. But the other thing we learned from every patient is actually there's not a unique pattern that works for each patient. So the voltage range was a factor of 70 between different patients, what gave them an optimal, and the patterns were actually quite varied. There are several patterns that were good for all patients, but the best for each patient was actually quite different. So how do we find that in an automatic way? Then we have other long-term things again, we have limitations in cytology, so we're trying to raise the money to get better implantable technology for humans. It's really expensive. And then, how do we better design these arrays? Even if we can find the optimal stimulus for each array, can we do a better array? Also, can we make this less invasive? The surgery is actually not that bad, but there's a large cohort of the spinal population which can't really safely sustain this surgery. And so I'll talk about that at the end of the talk. That's some of the blue sky stuff we're doing. Okay, so how do we tackle these issues? So I'm an engineer, right? So I want a model. So I'm an engineer. I don't trust any model. And so we have sort of two parts of my group are actually working in each half. So the first part is modeling. So here we're starting with ideas which are very conventional. These are not new ideas. We're just applying them to this application. So coming from the kind of cardiac pacemaker and other communities that actually simulate the process of stimulating neurons, what one can do is actually build, this is basically a circle cut out of the middle of a three-dimensional model of a rat. You can actually build three-dimensional models of the spinal cord, the gray matter, white matter, cerebral spinal fluid, epidural fat, dura. And then also you can lay in then different putative models of the electrodes that you want to sort of test out. And so then you find and look up in the literature or measure all the electrical properties, resistance, capacitance, inductance of all these different tissue types. So then you add these in the model. So you go back and then you, in effect, solve Maxwell's equations on this 3D geometry. The way you do it is you sort of mesh this up. We use a commercial product called ComSol. Many of you may be familiar with it. They actually have a pretty good electrostatics package. And so now it turns out with spinal cord injury, there's some parts of Maxwell's equations you can turn off, like magnetics don't play an important role. So you get some simplification. But when you're done then, what you can do is actually come up with maps which tell you that, for example, in this array of the rat array that I showed you before with 27 electrodes, if we just chose this one as an anode and this one as a cathode, what would be the electric field distributions? And so you can then slice through different parts of the spinal cord and sort of see what the electric fields look like. That actually doesn't tell you a lot. The reason is because whether or not an individual neuron in that area is stimulated depends upon the diameter of the neuron, its orientation with respect to field, and surprisingly the curvature of that neuron. So then what you have to do is couple these electric fields to models of the biophysics of individual neurons and then sort of come up with a kind of a potential which tells you how likely is that neuron sort of going to actually fire or not. So actually after you study a putative neuron in different areas of the spinal cord, you can then produce these kind of heat maps which tell you that for certain array combinations, which parts of the cord are likely to be inhibited here in blue or excited here in sort of orange. All right, so we use these models in a number of ways that'll be clear a little bit later in the talk. So here's Scott's question. It is Scott, right? Steve, excuse me, I'm sorry. So actually, how do we find the stimuli? So this isn't put into complete clinical practice yet, but this is sort of where we are research-wise. So we thought for a long time and sort of said, well, well, let's formulate this selection of the particular electrode pattern as a problem in active learning. I'm not a machine learning theorist. All right, so we first started to look at it, and then we sort of convinced ourselves that the cycle should look something like this. So apply a stimulus to the rat. From the technical point of view, we have to assume something about the rat's spinal cord, that its spinal cord lives in some function space. Then we actually take a measurement of actually how well the rat does, or the human in either case. That's actually a fairly subtle issue that I'll talk about a little bit later. And then the algorithm kind of decides, okay, should I continue with the same stimulus or should I actually apply a new stimulus right now? So we'll see in a second that we decided to formulate this as a class of machine learning problems called bandit problems. And so we were lucky after we started working this that actually Caltech hired Andreas Krauss, who got his PhD here at CMU in the machine learning group. And so with Andreas, we worked for a long time on this problem. So, but here's the analogy between spinal cords in Las Vegas. So those of you who know the bandit problem, it comes from the lingo that actually gambling in Vegas are going to the slot machines, which are one-arm bandits. So here's the slot machine problem that you have and why it's the same as the spinal cord tuning problem. So you walk into the gallery with a certain amount of coin. So we walk into the clinic, we have only so many hours with the patient, all right? And so what you want to do in Las Vegas is start to now plunk nickels into these sort of different machines. What you don't know ahead of time is actually what is the payoff distribution of each machine. So each machine we assume has a different mean payoff and may have a different distribution of payoff, but we don't know what they are. So now what you'd like to do is to figure out a strategy whereby, and it may be a feedback strategy, where as you learn more about different machines, you start to get more focused about where you put your nickels, so that over time, what you can do is maximize your total reward so you walk away with the most coin. So from the machine learning point of view, what you do is you minimize what's called the total regret. So the idea is if you knew where the best arm was or the best electrode combination, so for us, each time we pull an arm in the slot machine, it's like choosing one particular pattern and one voltage and one frequency for our electrode array. We just have billions of them to go through, so we have billions of slot machines to test. If we knew the optimum, then we actually measure what reward we got from a particular machine. That difference is what we call the regret. And so what you can prove, as you'll see in a couple of slides, that actually if you can prove that the regret decays in a certain way, you can then prove that actually you will converge to the jackpot eventually at some time. And so the key issue then is how fast can you get to the jackpot? So I'm gonna maybe buzz through this a little bit so I stay on time. So now you can imagine what the bandit theory tells you is if I have a billion combinations, if I don't know anything about the relationship between the different slot machines, I'll eventually have to pull all billion. So you want to make some assumption about the fact that some machines are related to other machines. So in the spinal cord, it means if I stimulate in one area, you would expect similar stimulation should give similar responses. So we didn't know at the time what that correlation function was, but if now you can assume that actually the correlation between all of those arms is modeled as a Gaussian process, which is just a function space where there's a Gaussian distribution of functions, then you can essentially impose some smoothness on what you learn, and also it doesn't say what the structure is, but it says there is some structure there and we'll help you find it. So kind of here's the kind of naive idea. I apologize to the machine learning people in the audience for how naive this is. So part of these bandit learning algorithms, you have to define something called a kernel, which basically says if I make a measurement at one location, so for example now, this is the analogy with trying to find the optimal electrode combination for the patient. Imagine you're on the ocean and you can't see the bottom of the ocean, but you want to measure the height of the ocean, come up with a map. And so if you drop this line here and take a measurement, if you're in soft sandy soil, you know that the measurement here, the amplitude or the height of the surface won't vary too much. But if you're in really rocky soil, so then you know that the measurement you take there can't extend very far, okay? So you have to start off also with some hypothesis about how similar electrode combinations are related to each other. And so one of the reasons that people use the Gaussian process theory is there's actually some nice formulas then for actually updating what's called the mean function, and then some very nice formulas for updating the covariance function, which is the uncertainty in the function that you're learning. And I'm going through this quickly because I have a nice animation in a second. And then the key thing which we learned from Andreas is then how do you search the space? So we use an old idea called an upper confidence bound algorithm. And so what these algorithms do is they actually give you a cool way to trade off exploration, which is I want to learn new things about the array, versus exploitation. I want to give the patient good therapy by spending some of the time at high-performing stimuli. And so by choosing then a weighting factor which trades off between giving the patient good therapy versus learning more about the array, if you do this at the right timing, you can actually then sort of prove convergence of these algorithms. So here's how it works in practice. So imagine I have just a one-dimensional array, and so I'm trying to just learn the voltage distribution above this one-dimensional array. I don't know what it is, the voltage distribution of the optimal therapy for the patient. So in the beginning, I just assume I know nothing. Oh man, this is awful. There's gray on my screen that's just not showing up on here. There's uncertainty bands that you just can't see. I don't know why the projector is not doing it. So what happens then is, based on your model of uncertainty, what you can quickly do is find out there's regions of the cord that can't be good, and then over time what you do is you tend to focus on the sort of good regions of the cord, and so you can reasonably quickly actually converge to kind of optimal therapy for that patient. Okay, so the first thing we found out is we said, great, so we went over to UCLA and we started doing it, and they hated it. And the reason is because we apply the stimulus, we can measure how the rat does very quickly, but it takes us several minutes to compute a bunch of metrics that we can compute the reward with. And so the grad students and the postdocs and the mouse are just sitting there doing nothing. And so they said, and also when we went to the clinic, the same thing happened. They're like, the patient's sitting there and you have these 10 therapists at $20 an hour sitting there doing nothing. And so they're like, well, can we do the following thing? Can we actually now make up a batch process? So the idea now is the algorithm actually has to predict 5 choices to test. Then you test them, then it turns out at about 5, for both rats and humans, they need a break. And so while they're breaking, then you can do your crunching of all your data and then also the decision process to lead to the next stimuli. It's this CMU, got to do one theorem. And so what we were able to then prove is for a large class of functions that actually this learning algorithm with batches actually has sublinear regret. So what that means in practice is that over time, we will actually provably converge to the optimal. All right, as long as all the assumptions underlying the theory, which aren't that many assumptions, are sort of true. So it gives me confidence as an engineer when I go into the clinic, I know eventually I will find the right sort of optimum. We did an interesting study with this approach. So what we decided to do was a double-blind study. So we actually then had the machine pick 5 stimuli, and then actually we had an experienced postdoc doing neurophysiology out of the room. So after the machine would give 5 stimuli to the rat, we would evaluate the rat how well they did the stimuli. The postdoc would come in the room, choose 5 stimuli, apply it to the rat, not knowing what the machine did, and then the machine would go next, not knowing what the human did. The reason we did that is actually over time, no matter what you do to the cord, the therapy will improve the cords. We had to find some way to match the machine and human at the same time. So that's why we interleave these experiments. And so what's plotted here for one particular rat, we name our rats affectionately. This is rat number 5. In blue is actually how the human therapist did on what's called the average reward. So on every day, what was the average quality of the rat standing as measured by some muscle activity. And in green is the machine. So what we found is statistically significant that actually the machine provided on average better therapy than the human. What's plotted in this right here is what's called the maximum reward, which means up until this point, what was the best electrode combination that either the machine or the human, I'll get your question in a second, what was the best one that it got? And so what we see is that the machine and the human are about equally as good as jumping around and finding good stimuli, but that on average the machine does a little bit better. Yes?
It almost looks like the advantage we get is the very first, in the beginning, the very first step.
Possibly. That's a good question. So one of the things I will point out, and because you noticed it, this is right around day 23 after the surgery. So what happens in rats between days 21 and 23, they actually have a cord shock. And so you get actually some tricky phenomena here which are unrelated to the algorithm, or which are sort of biophysical. And so, it's a fair thing. What we've done is we've done this actually in 7 rats now. And so we've actually found this statistically significant improvement or increase or better than human in actually all 7 rats. So we're pretty confident about that. Okay, so great. So I went to Louisville and I said, all right, I got an algorithm. Let's go. And so it was like, okay, what reward signal, do you guys want to give me? And so now I hope none of the people in Louisville are listening. So they're clinicians, and they're like, we can't give you a function that measures human standing. Standing is a very complicated phenomenon. There's no function that measures it. And I'm like, oh, what am I going to do, right? I just spent 3 years working on machine learning that needs a function to kind of do this. So because we'd used muscle activity in rats, I said, well, why don't we just try muscle activity in humans? And so they said, okay. So they gave us a philosophy about how we should process the EMG to pull out information metrics which they believe were correlated with good standing. And we tried it on the patient, and they hated us because it just didn't work. So I thought, listen, we're using the same code as a rat, so I know it's not the code. So then we did the following thing. So we said, all right, let's actually now take the theory that we got from the therapist and actually now have the patient actually score how well they thought they did based on the metric that actually the patients give us. And it was exactly inversely opposite what the therapist thought. And so the things they thought would be the worst, actually the patient felt the best at, and vice versa. So like, oh crap, now what do we do? So we said, okay, what if we can actually just get the therapist to score something? Just give a 1 to 10 score. The theory would allow us to do that. And they said, yeah, sure, we can come up with a scoring system, and we did. It's a very good one. But the problem is that actually it wasn't repeatable across therapists. Each therapist would come up with a different score. And so we said, all right, but at least what we found is the relative scoring was actually conserved across things. So if this patient thought one was 2 better than another one, the other therapist thought it was 2 or 2.5 better. There was some noise. So the grad student who's starting on the project now, I said, okay, Yi-Sung, you're screwed. All right, so you don't have a function, the therapist can't agree, and it's not repeatable. All right, give me a learning theory that'll work on that. And so fortunately, he found this really interesting work by Yi-Sung Yu, who got his PhD at Cornell, and then postdoc here in the machine learning group at CMU. So we started using his work, and I wasn't involved, and as we started using work, all of a sudden, Caltech hired him, and so it was great. So I now collaborate with Yi-Sung Yu. So in his thesis, he developed something called a dueling bandit. So in a regular bandit, right, you pull the arm and you actually get a measurement of reward. It might be noisy. In a dueling bandit, what happens is you pull 2 arms. You actually don't know the absolute magnitude of either arm, but what you do know is whether one arm gives you more reward than another. So it's just like going to an optometrist. Those of you who have glasses know, right? The optometrist says, you know, is this lens better or is this lens better? So basically that's the learning signal we have to work with. Is one better than the other? And it's surprising you can actually develop a learning signal with that. As you might imagine, it's a very slow learning theory. So one of the things my student Yanan Sui sort of developed was what we call the dueling bandit with subgroup rank feedback. So the idea is we want to do batches anyway, and so every time you get a batch of measurements, that gives you a relative ranking, and what you can prove then is that actually gives you, in effect, d squared, if d is the batch size, over 2 learning measurements. And so he figured out how to speed up the algorithm so that he's able to prove then that actually the algorithm was sublinear in the number of trials and inverse proportional to the batch size. So the bigger number of batches, the sort of faster that you learn, and kind of inversely proportional to kind of the precision of your measurements. So we can actually have noisy matches. So even if the patient and the therapist make a mistake as to sort of which lens is better or which stimuli is better, it's okay as long as it's not a bias, as long as it's a random mistake, we can actually handle it. So I won't go through the detail of this theory. The idea is a little bit different than Gaussian processes. What you do is you start with a big pool of arms, and then you start to throw out arms based on a statistical confidence measure. And over time, you end up with sort of a good pool of arms. So we went back to Louisville, and it worked. It worked great. And so what this is 1 week with one particular subject called ATC. And so we could get about 12 trials a day with each subject before they got tired. So this is about 1 day. So what's scored here is the actual composite score of a number of different factors on standing as graded by clinicians. And then here is sort of time. And so you see at the beginning, the machine doesn't know much about the patient. And so the performance goes kind of bobs up and down. But you can see over time, it keeps converging and converging. So in 1 week, we hit about 95% of the quality of standing that actually the clinicians would get in 3 or 4 months. So we know it works now. And now, one thing which we don't know is how long it will converge. It's tough for us to get enough patient time. That time is really valuable and expensive. And so we're working now on sort of longer term studies. Another interesting thing that we sort of found out, and it's no surprise because the spinal cord has sort of fixed anatomy, and each person's anatomy is fairly constant. is now this dueling bandit theory, again, is partly it's very slow because we don't have any structure between the arms. So we don't know if we do this stimulation, will another stimulation actually give us a similar result or not. And so Univ did an interesting study. He sort of said, okay, let's take some of these computational tools that we have and do the following thing. Let's actually compute, here's the electric field density for a particular electrode combination. So in this combination, the reds are positive electrodes that we turned on in the array, the grays are negative electrodes, and the whites, the electrodes just weren't turned on, they were floating and free. Here's another combination, so here's electric field densities. Let's convolve them, okay? Just get a convolution, single scalar number, which says how similar are these two fields. Now let's check by doing the following thing. We found over the week the best combination of electrode patterns for this particular subject. We had 42, or actually no, almost 70 different other configurations. We convolved each one and came up with a correlation score. And then we plotted them on the scaled score of actually how well the patient did. And we got 93% correlation confidence. So which means and again, it's no surprise, we just sort of confirmed it, that these computational models, even though they can't absolutely tell you things about the spinal cord, they can actually tell you if one stimulation is going to be good, another one will be this much good to it. And so Univ's been working. In fact, we just got a breakthrough last week. We now have all the learning theory done for this dueling bandits with correlation structure. And so we haven't tested it in the clinic yet. So that's kind of what we're working towards next. So one of the first things that was done, Yuri and Parag Gad and Reggie Edgerton led a study. So this is a purposely fuzzy study, picture over here because of medical privacy issues. This is a remarkable guy. He's an Irishman who was blind at 22, and then because of his blindness had a tragic fall and became paralyzed. And so he's actually a motivational speaker. He goes around the world giving speeches. So he was one of the first people to buy an Exobionics exoskeleton. So we didn't make this exoskeleton. This is commercial, completely off the shelf exoskeleton from Exo. But what was done then is applying a couple of electrodes to his back using this cool Russian stimulator. And so what I'll sort of point your eye out to here is these Exos can work in two ways. So in one way, what you can do is have what's called a passive mode, which is the Exo just moves the legs, whether the patient wants it or not. There's also what they call an active mode, you might call it an assisted mode, where the Exo tries to measure how much force the body is sort of putting on the Exo and tries to give just the least amount of actuation to complete the sort of step cycle. So what was tried with him is over several weeks is first walking him with no assistance, then walking him with the assistance, and then we put the electrode array on. So here's data where what we did is we had no stimulation and just driven his legs, no stimulation, having him try to drive the exoskeleton, then each of those same two conditions with different types of stimuli. What's plotted on here is sort of the integrated average of the muscle activity in a couple of key muscles. RF is rectus femoris, it's a quad muscle. Soleus is a calf muscle right here. And so what you'll notice is then when the stimulation is off, he can generate a little bit of muscle activity, but if he weren't in the frame, he couldn't actually move his muscles. He's actually motor complete. But when all of a sudden you turn the stimulation on, then all of a sudden his muscles are actually generate a lot more force. And Exo actually gave us the keys to the kingdom, so we could actually measure the joint angles and measure the amount of current going to each motor. And so without stimulation, this is the amount of current that the Exo needed on the knee joint, because the rectus femoris is responsible for the knee, to actually move the Exo through a complete gait cycle. When you turn the stimulator on and use the passive mode, all of a sudden cuts the current in half. And then when you turn the stimulator on and use assisted needed, he almost drives the Exo himself. All right, not quite yet, right? He's not there. Maybe he'll never get there. But at least it's showing that this transcutaneous technology actually can do many things we saw with the implanted technology. I don't have a video of this. You have to just take my word for it. So last week I was in a really exciting session in the clinic in Santa Monica. We got our first patient standing, motor complete patient standing using just transcutaneous technology. So we don't even have to implant now to get people to stand. So one of the things I'll just end up with is I'm working then on computational models about how we can actually use this transcutaneous technology to sort of stimulate sort of different parts of the spinal cord. And so one of the sort of things we're working on is you build these models, and then what you can do is place different hypothetical combinations of electrodes and sort of see which parts of the spinal cord you can sort of stimulate. And then you can look at different effects, like basically a phased array effect. So you actually can't get phased array here, but there's something called charge injection, which allows you to get something like a phased array, so you can actually sweep stimuli up and down the cord in varying ways as a function of time. We haven't tried that in patients yet, but we think that sort of might be useful. And so this is something we're sort of pushing on very hard. So the final thing, I'm out of time, so I'll just briefly mention, and I won't bore you because this is fairly straightforward. So in the clinic in Louisville, this is how they do the stand training. And what we found is stand training is the most cost-effective way to help these patients. And so originally when our study was over at the end of the first year, our protocol with the government was we were supposed to take the arrays out. And so I was actually there in Louisville when they sort of said, hey Rob, we gotta schedule your explant surgery. And his answer was, the hell you will. So what I had to do was actually quickly in my garage over Christmas build the first home stand frame out of PVC pipe from Home Depot. And so we've gone through a whole series of these stand frames now, and then have sort of instrumented them with Kinect sensors and force sensors, and we're also now starting to make them robotic, so we can tilt the patient and do other things. So the robotics is finally coming back in. And so our goal now then is to put these things in people's homes after training in the clinic, so we can then monitor them using the algorithms I talked about for electrode selection, so we can continually update their stimuli patterns over time so they don't have to come back in the clinic. So let me conclude there is, I'm very excited about this work. I get to work with a big team. Again, let me stress, this is the work of a big team here, not all my work. And none of us think that this is anything like a cure for spinal cord injury. It's just a therapy. But it seems to be now through almost 24 patients in different ways, consistently sort of working. And so we're excited about that. And so we do have a study that I didn't talk about today for quadriplegics also. So we've been actually implanting or also using transcutaneous over the cervical area and actually getting nice hand function recovery. And we're looking at stroke a little bit. I don't know squat about stroke, so we're just kind of looking from the outside. And so let me kind of conclude that, again, I have a big team I work with, some great students, and your tax dollars have helped me to kind of do this. Thank you.
So questions?
Yep. Yes?
So in the first standing subject that you showed, it looked like there was some spasticity.
Yeah, absolutely. So over time, that spasticity goes away. And so our third subject actually was quite spastic before the implantation, and actually the spasticity reduced quite a bit after his training. It almost went away. And there was actually, the following experiment happened because of my mistake. I was late in getting him his stand frame to go home with, and so he wasn't able to train at home for a while, and the spasticity came back. But as soon as he recovered training, it sort of went away again. And so we're not the first actually people to mention, I forget I can give you the reference if you're interested in. There was a study earlier than us that actually used epidural stimulation for looking at spasticity in particular. So in many ways what we've seen is we've kind of confirmed that earlier study. Yes, Arun?
You treated this problem very much like a bandit problem.
Yep.
And it kind of is, but also the person is...
Yes, it is. It's absolutely a bandit problem, Arun.
But it's more than a bandit problem because the person's also learning to adapt.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
It's more like a reinforcement learning.
Yeah. And we've been staying away that. And so, but that's the next thing on our horizon. So there's two ways you can think about it. One is reinforcement. The other one you can think about as a bandit where the underlying function is not stationary. Because people's cords are plastic. Again, something I didn't talk about is the optimal array not only different for every patient, the optimal pattern, but actually changes over time. So one of the reasons we want an automated algorithm is to kind of keep up with the patient. So whether you think of it as reinforcement, non-stationary, there's lots of ways to think about it.
You didn't see very much change over time?
Oh, absolutely, you see change. Yeah, no, absolutely. So with the rats, you can actually see it fairly rapidly. With the humans, it's a little bit slower, but what happens then with the humans is they actually have to go back to the clinic and get their arrays tuned up. Yeah. Yes?
Just to piggyback on that, you mentioned that you initially looked at subjective feedback from the user as part of your objective function and rejected it because it didn't match with the clinical evaluation.
No, I think what it was is the clinical theory of what should be the important signal didn't match with the user. We trusted the user more than the clinicians.
I see, so your final objective function does use user input.
So actually, no, it does. At the moment, it only uses clinician input.
I see.
But it's something we've been thinking about. And again, I'm no machine learning expert. But in some sense, we're thinking about modeling this in a number of different ways. One is a problem where there's side information from the patient. Another one that there's two oracles. But the problem we haven't figured out yet is, how much can we trust each oracle? We don't know how to build into the theory that we've got two now different uncertain oracles that may not agree.
That would help a little bit with the translation to home therapy.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, no, because one of the problems, and it's a great question, is even if we put these things in the home and get all this data, someone's got to evaluate this data. So that becomes then a rate-limiting bottleneck of providing therapy. And so the more we can incorporate the patient's input, the sort of less time we would need an experienced clinician or doctor to evaluate the data and make decisions. Because I'd imagine, just based on my other work, is that in the beginning there's no way the FDA is going to allow the patient to tune up their own way. It's always going to have to go through a doctor first. Yeah. Yes, question?
Do patients find it frustrating that they can't take the technology home?
Well, so the patients which are implanted with the epidural, they do take this technology home. It's there all the time, and so what you can do is because this was built for pain first, and oftentimes with pain what happens as the patient is standing or sleeping or driving, they need a different combination of electrode patterns because the array shifts a little bit. So it was called a patient programmer. So we can send them home with up to 4 different patterns, but it can be frustrating for them because one is over time, their pattern shifts and they can't reprogram it, so they can only go home with what's fixed. And then the other one is they may have situations in their life where they may want more than 4, and that's just the limit at the moment.
So I'm wondering, Joel, in what you've done, I realize the goal is to make people walk, but did you get any new insight on how to make better robots, or better walking robots?
Not yet. And no, it's a great question I get asked all the time, and not that it's a trivial question, it's just so far we've been struggling with the medical device technology and struggling with trying to understand the neuroscience better, that we're not even to the biomechanics level. So one of the things one of my current students is looking at is how to incorporate sort of mechanics and control theory into how we do the stimuli optimization and see if that will help us better understand. So then the interesting question is, can we turn it around and apply it to robotics? I don't know. I'm happy to get input from other people here that have great ideas on that. Yeah, like him. Yeah. Yes?
You talked briefly about electrode technology. And so like how much better can it get with better electrodes? And if you could get...
That's an open question.
You pick the electrodes that you do anything?
No, we may want to talk about this offline because it's a long story. But so I have one figure here, and I just rushed through it because I didn't have it. So one thing we've been able to do is we take all the data we got from all the patients. So we actually now have a large number of input-output pairs where we apply a stimulation. We get a grading from an experienced clinician. So we have hundreds of those pairs now. What we also have is, because of our simulation technology, is we can simulate what is the electric fields that comes out of each of these patterns. We then use standard feature extraction techniques to then figure out what are the most important features of the electric field that are best correlated with good standing only right now. So there it is right there. So there's the electrode array. What the green is, it says in those areas it's important to control the amplitude of the voltage. Wherever there's a red vector, it says those are the areas where it's important to control the first gradient of the potential field, because it turns out that the gradient plays an important role in neural activation. The even bigger thing is actually the second derivative, and so the blue arrows those are the directions which are important and where the second derivative is maximized. All right, that's just about a week-old result. We don't know how to put it together yet, but how would we use this? So we're actually, the students working on this at this very instant is how we would use this to design new electrodes. Now what we would do is we would, using whatever your favorite optimization process is, have electrodes that can vary their position and vary their size and vary their number, and sort of look at the electric fields and then find which combinations are most correlated with the electric field features that we found were best for standing. So that would be a standing optimized array. So that's our current theory. I'm happy for you to debunk it. I'm not saying it's a great theory right now. It's the best we got at the moment. Yes?
Piggybacking on that, what you do have there is a way of stimulating certain geographies in the spinal cord.
Yeah, and so one of the things we're working on right now, and so it's difficult to get this data from the specific patients. We know where we put the array in surgery, but we don't know how much it shifts. So now what we'd like to do is correlate this with the anatomy and sort of see, are there special circuits that are, correlated with that structure right there, and that will tell us these are the circuits that are really important for standing. We're not there yet, and like I said, it may be hard to get that data. Yes, Glenn?
You said that your current working hypothesis is that you're getting some sort of leakage signal through gap inhibition.
For the voluntary control aspect that we see, yes.
Have you looked at any sort of positive feedback loop to try to just directly amplify it?
No, it's a good question. So one of my current graduate students, it's my student, but working very closely with Reggie's group at UCLA, is we're doing two things. We're working actually on an animal model for this voluntary control. So it's a different thing to be able to induce an injury so that when the rat is unstimulated, it can't make any voluntary motions. But when it's stimulated, it can make voluntary motions. We actually just succeeded a couple weeks ago proving that model out. So the next thing we'll be looking at is we're going to actually be stimulating below the cord. We're going to be recording below the injury, like we always do. We're going to be recording above the injury, and we're actually going to be implanting a Utah array in cortex. And so we're going to actually have the ability to stimulate and record all up and down the nervous system. And so we're hoping to use that preparation to do exactly what you mentioned. But at this point, we haven't done it yet, and what I can tell you based on past experience, there's all kinds of ways that could fail. It's a very difficult animal preparation because it's going to require 3 or 4 different surgeries. And rats are really tough, but they're only tough to a point. If there's no other questions, then I don't want to organize things, but I guess there's a small reception afterwards. Or
Wow, that's nice.
I guess I shouldn't ask you. I just saw my schedule, I guess. Or if not, I'm hanging around for a while. I'm going out to dinner with Howie later tonight, so I'm happy to hang around if there's anyone has any small questions you want to answer.
Yes, we'll do this. If you want, you can hang around. If there is a reception, I never know. It's in the Robo.
They're in the new one.
Oh, it's above?
It's in the old director's office.
Oh, it's a nice place. Okay, so why don't you just all go to the 4th floor right now to Marshall and Matt's old office, and Joel will find you there.